Most pirates didn't die from swords. They didn't go down in some cinematic final battle with a naval officer while flames consumed the rigging above them and the crew cheered from the water. That happened, sure. But it was the exception. The real killer was quieter than that. It worked slowly, in the dark below deck. Inside the food, they had no choice but to eat. Inside the water, they drank from barrels that had been sitting in the hold for 6 weeks. Inside the absence of things the human body needs and doesn't know it's missing until it starts to fall apart. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted roughly from the 1680s to the 1730s. A few chaotic decades spread across the Atlantic and the Caribbean, when thousands of men abandoned legitimate seafaring, or were never part of it to begin with, and chose a life outside the law. They are the pirates we still imagine when someone says the word, the black flags, the articles of agreement, the democratic votes on where to sail next, the captains who ruled by consent rather than crown appointment. Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny. Names that have survived 3 centuries because the lives attached to them were genuinely extraordinary. What we don't imagine is what was actually in the barrel they cracked open for dinner. It was bad. Genuinely, almost impressively bad. The kind of bad that makes you reconsider the romance of the whole enterprise. You are listening to Histomnia. If this kind of story helps you rest, consider subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? We love knowing who is with us in the quiet hours. And if there is a topic you would like to hear next, leave it below. Here is something worth understanding before we go any further. Sailors in the 1700s, pirate or otherwise, were not naive about what they were signing up for. They knew what the food was like. They had eaten it before. They knew about the biscuits that came out of storage riddled with weevil larvae, and they knew about the salt beef that smelled like something had died in the barrel, which was technically accurate. They knew that men on long voyages lost their teeth, that their gums went soft and black, that old wounds from years ago could mysteriously reopen without any new injury. They knew all of this, and they went anyway. That tells you something about the alternatives. For a lot of the men who ended up under a pirate flag in the early 1700s, the choice was not between piracy and a comfortable life ashore. It was between piracy and a legitimate naval or merchant posting, which came with almost identical food, considerably more flogging, less democratic governance, and a fraction of the potential earnings. When Bartholomew Roberts lost his ship and was taken aboard a pirate vessel in 1719, he reportedly spent about 6 weeks deciding which side he was on before choosing piracy. He went on to capture over 400 ships. The food was probably not the deciding factor, but it wasn't worse. What makes the food story genuinely interesting, beyond the grimness of it, is that it wasn't incidental to how piracy worked. It shaped everything. Where a ship could sail depended on what provisions it carried and how long those provisions could last. How long a crew would stay loyal depended significantly on whether they were eating or starving. The decision to attack a particular vessel was sometimes driven not by the cargo manifest, but by the knowledge that the other ship had fresh food aboard. Pirate raids on coastal settlements often prioritized the smokehouse and the provisions store over the counting house. Food was power. The captain, who could feed his men, could keep his men. The one who couldn't had a problem that no amount of charisma could solve for long. There is a reason that ship's cooks appear so frequently in the records of pirate trials, not because they were particularly violent or particularly criminal by pirate standards, but because they were essential. A crew without a cook was in trouble. A crew with a good cook, someone who could take the grim raw materials of a long ocean voyage and turn them into something that didn't make the men actively despair. That crew had something worth protecting. So, what were they actually eating? What did breakfast look like 3 weeks out of Tortuga, with no land in sight, and the nearest port still a week away? What was in the pot that got passed around the lower deck on a Tuesday evening somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, with nothing visible in any direction except water? What did the men drink when the water had gone green and started to smell? And how often did that happen? What did they catch off the side of the ship when the provisions ran low? And how did they cook it on a vessel made entirely of wood? And what happened to a human body? A real, specific, historical human body when it went months at sea on this diet? The answers are worse than you probably expect. And stranger. And occasionally almost funny, in the way that extreme deprivation sometimes tips into absurdity before it tips into tragedy. Close your eyes if you like. Let the sounds of the world around you grow quiet. Over the next few hours, we're going to go through all of it. We'll start with hardtack, the biscuit that was the absolute foundation of shipboard eating, that sailors hated with a passion and could not survive without. And that has a texture best described as a brick that wanted to be food when it grew up. Then we'll get into the salt meat, sitting in those brine barrels for months, growing stranger by the week. We'll spend time with scurvy, the disease that killed more sailors in the age of sail than combat, storms, and shipwreck combined. And that did things to the human body that are difficult to describe without flinching. We'll talk about rum and why drinking it was not decadence, but practical necessity. About the creatures they caught off the rail, turtles, flying fish, sharks, and what it meant to eat something fresh after weeks of preserved misery. About the pure animal joy of reaching a port and eating food that had been alive that morning. About the raids where the first thing men grabbed was not gold but sugar, not jewels but citrus, and about the cook himself, who he was, how he worked, and why losing him was sometimes worse than losing a cannon. This is the story of what pirates actually ate, and it starts with a biscuit that could survive a shipwreck, outlast the men who baked it, and still technically be considered food. Imagine you are hungry. Not the kind of hungry where you skip lunch and start thinking about dinner at 3 in the afternoon. Real hungry, the kind that has been building for days, that sits in your stomach like a stone. That makes you think about food constantly and in great detail, the way people think about water in a desert. You are 3 weeks out of port. The fresh bread ran out on day 4. The cheese went on day 6. Whatever fruit they had loaded at the last stop is long gone, and the smell it left behind in the hold is not a pleasant memory. What you have now is hardtack. You reach into the sack and pull one out. It is a square biscuit, roughly the size of your palm, maybe a centimeter thick, the color of old bone. It weighs almost nothing. It makes a sound when you tap it against the ship's rail, a hollow, hard knock, like tapping a piece of wood, which is not entirely inaccurate as a description. The recipe for hardtack is almost insultingly simple. Flour, water, and salt mixed into a stiff dough, rolled flat, punched through with holes so it bakes evenly, and then cooked and cooked and cooked until every last trace of moisture has been driven out of it. The holes are not decorative. They are functional. They let the steam escape during baking so the biscuit doesn't crack or bubble. The result is something that is less bread and more a ceramic approximation of bread. In a dry environment, hardtack lasts almost forever. That was the point. Armies and navies had been issuing it for centuries by the time the Golden Age pirates were sailing. The Romans baked a version called bucellatum. Medieval crusaders carried something similar across Europe and into the Middle East. The English Navy standardized their ration in the 1500s and barely changed the recipe for 200 years after that. In the American Civil War, soldiers on both sides were still eating hardtack. The Union soldiers called it teeth dullers and sheet iron crackers, and a number of other names that expressed their feelings about it with considerable clarity. The Confederate version was sometimes called hardtack too, though what they actually had access to varied enormously depending on the year and how badly the supply lines were being disrupted. The reason it lasted was also the reason it was terrible to eat. No moisture meant no mold, for a while anyway. No moisture also meant a texture that resisted the human jaw in a way that food is not supposed to resist. New hardtack, fresh from the oven, was merely very hard. Old hardtack, the kind that had been sitting in a ship's hold for weeks or months, became something else entirely. It didn't soften with age. If anything, it became more committed to its own hardness, as though it had spent the intervening months thinking about it. and deciding that this was who it was going to be. Eating it dry was an experience. You put it in your mouth and you worked at it. You couldn't really bite it so much as apply sustained pressure until something gave, and what gave was usually not the hardtack. Sailors lost teeth to hardtack. This was not a metaphor. Actual teeth cracked against biscuits that had no intention of yielding. The standard technique was to soak it first, in water, in broth, in whatever liquid was available, and let it sit until it had softened enough to be chewed without structural risk. Some sailors dunked it in their coffee or their rum. Some crumbled it into soups or stews and let the moisture do the work. Either way, you were not eating hardtack so much as defeating it through patience and liquid until it submitted to being food. But here is where it gets worse. The moisture problem worked in both directions. Keep hardtack completely dry and it lasted. Let it get damp, which on a wooden ship crossing the Atlantic was essentially inevitable, and things started to happen inside it. The biscuits were stored in canvas sacks or wooden barrels in the hold, below the waterline, in a space that was never entirely dry and never entirely ventilated. The Atlantic is not a dry place. Ships leaked, condensation formed, humidity crept in, and once moisture touched the hardtack, a clock started running. Mold was the obvious one. Green and white patches appeared first, then spread, then consumed the biscuit entirely if left long enough. Sailors picked off what they could see and ate the rest. There was not much choice in the matter. But the mold was almost secondary to the other inhabitants that moved into hardtack as soon as conditions permitted. Weevils, the Cytophilus granarius, the grain weevil, is a small brown beetle, a few millimeters long, that lays its eggs inside grain and flour. By the time the flour has been baked into hardtack and loaded onto a ship, there are almost certainly already eggs inside it. The baking kills the adults and most of the eggs, but not all of them. The ones that survive wake up at sea, somewhere in the warm, dark hold, and begin doing what weevils do. They eat, they grow, they reproduce. A sack of hardtack that went aboard clean could be thoroughly infested within a few weeks. Sailors had a technique for dealing with this. Before eating a biscuit, you knocked it hard against a solid surface, the table, the barrel, whatever was nearby. The impact disturbed the weevils and they fell out, or at least most of them did. Then you ate the biscuit quickly before they could find their way back in. Or you ate in the dark, which many sailors reportedly preferred, on the theory that what you couldn't see wasn't really happening. There is a certain grim pragmatism to that approach. The nutritional content of hardtack was approximately nothing beyond calories. It had carbohydrates. It had some protein from the flour. It had almost no fat, almost no vitamins, almost no minerals of any significance. Eating nothing but hardtack for long enough was itself a health problem, independent of the weevils and the mold. It kept you alive in the most minimal sense. It kept your body burning, but it contributed almost nothing to the things the body actually needs to function over the long term. No vitamin C, no vitamin A, no iron worth mentioning. Sailors who lived on hardtack and salted meat for months at sea were running nutritional deficits that would eventually make themselves known in ways that were very difficult to ignore. And we will get to all of that in considerable detail later. For now, the important thing to understand about hardtack is the relationship sailors had with it. They hated it. They complained about it constantly and creatively. They gave it nicknames that reflected their low opinion of it, and they depended on it completely, with the kind of dependence you develop on something you cannot live without and cannot enjoy, the way a person in the desert feels about the last canteen. Hardtack was not good. It was not close to good, but it was there. It was dense with calories. It didn't require refrigeration or cooking. It fit in a sack. It could be ration controlled. And in a world where the alternative was nothing, nothing was a powerful argument. The experienced sailor developed a relationship with hardtack that was less about enjoyment and more about management. You learned when to soak it and for how long. You learned which biscuits were more infested and which were merely bad. You learned to eat enough to keep functioning without thinking too much about what you were eating, because thinking about it in detail did not improve the experience. This was a survival skill in its own right, the ability to eat something terrible with a kind of deliberate detachment, to separate the act of fueling the body from any notion of pleasure or satisfaction. It was a skill they would need constantly, because hardtack was just the beginning. The full diet of a pirate ship at sea had other elements, and most of them were no better, and some of them were considerably worse in ways that hardtack, to its credit, never quite managed to be. Hardtack was the foundation. But a man cannot live on biscuits alone, at least not for long, and not without consequences that become obvious fairly quickly. The body needs protein. It needs fat. It needs something that at least gestures in the direction of a meal. Something that, when combined with the biscuit in a bowl of hot water, produces something that could, with some generosity of spirit, be called a stew. That something was salt meat. And if you were at sea in the 1700s and you reached into a barrel and pulled out a piece of it, your first reaction was probably not gratitude. Salt preservation is one of the oldest food technologies humans ever developed. The basic principle is simple. Salt draws moisture out of meat through osmosis, and without moisture, most of the bacteria and molds that cause decomposition cannot survive. Do it correctly, and you can keep meat edible for months, sometimes longer. The Egyptians preserved fish with salt. The Romans built an entire economy around salted fish paste. Medieval European peasants salted pork every autumn, so they would have something to eat in February. By the time the Golden Age pirates were operating, salted meat had been a standard provision for seafarers for centuries, and the techniques involved were well understood. Understanding something and enjoying it are different matters. The process of producing salt beef or salt pork, the two most common forms of preserved meat aboard ships, began before the voyage. The meat was cut into pieces, rubbed or packed in coarse salt, and then placed into barrels and covered with brine, which is just salt dissolved in water at very high concentration. The barrels were sealed and stored. Then they went into the ship. Then the ship went to sea. Then the barrels sat in the hold for weeks or months, depending on how long the voyage lasted and how carefully the provisions had been rationed. What came out of those barrels when they were finally opened was not what went in. The color was the first thing. Fresh beef is red. Salt beef, after weeks or months in brine, has gone grey. Sometimes greenish grey. Sometimes greyish brown. The color varies depending on how good the original meat was, how clean the salt was, how well the barrel was sealed, and how long it has been sitting. None of the color variations are appetizing. All of them are surprising the first few times you encounter them, and merely depressing after that. The texture was the second thing. Salt draws out moisture, which means salt beef is dry, aggressively, almost insultingly dry, with a density that makes hardtack seem yielding by comparison. It had to be soaked before cooking, usually for 24 hours or more, in fresh water, if fresh water could be spared, which was often a significant qualification. Soaking rehydrated the meat somewhat and drew out some of the excess salt, which otherwise made it nearly impossible to eat without drinking extraordinary quantities of water afterward. On a ship where water was itself rationed, this created a problem that the cook had to manage carefully every single day. The smell deserves its own paragraph. Salt beef from a barrel that had been at sea for several weeks had a smell that sailors described in their journals and letters with a consistency that suggests they were not exaggerating. It was heavy, briny, and underneath the salt there was something else. Something that indicated the meat had been doing things inside the barrel that were not entirely controlled. Not always rotten in the sense of being inedible. Often somewhere in a territory between fine and not fine. In a region where the question of whether to eat it came down to how hungry you were and how much you trusted your own judgment about these things. Most sailors, most of the time, were hungry enough to trust it. The quality of the meat that went into those barrels varied enormously depending on where it was purchased, who purchased it, and how much they were willing to spend. Naval provisioning contracts in the 1700s were spectacularly corrupt. Contractors who supplied ships with provisions had every incentive to use the lowest quality meat they could pass off as acceptable. because the difference between acceptable and good went directly into their margins. Sailors on legitimate naval vessels complained constantly in the period's surviving records about provisions that were underweight, that had been packed in insufficient salt, that had gone bad before the ship even left port. Pirates, who were not operating through official supply chains, had a somewhat different problem. They often had no provisioning contracts at all, and sourced their salt meat through whatever means were available, which could mean purchasing it from sympathetic merchants in known pirate ports like Nassau or Tortuga, or taking it from captured vessels, or producing their own when the opportunity arose. The taking from captured vessels option was often the best of these, and we will get to it in some detail later. Salt pork was, by most accounts, somewhat more tolerable than salt beef. Pork takes salt well. The fat in pork, which beef largely lacks after it has been salted, helped retain some moisture and kept the texture from becoming quite so leathery. A piece of salt pork that had been properly soaked and then boiled for several hours could produce something that was, if not genuinely good, at least identifiable as food in a way that the beef sometimes wasn't. The fat that rendered out during boiling was collected and used in cooking as a lubricant, for preserving other things, for waterproofing leather. Nothing was wasted on a ship at sea. Fish was the other major protein source, and it came in two forms: the preserved fish loaded at the start of a voyage, and whatever could be caught fresh during the journey. The preserved variety was usually dried and salted cod or herring, staples of the North Atlantic trade that had been produced in enormous quantities since the medieval period. Dried salt cod, in particular, was a global commodity by the 1700s, fished off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and distributed across Europe, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic coast of the Americas. It was cheap, calorie-dense, and lasted well. It was also, after adequate soaking, somewhat less grim than salt beef. The texture of reconstituted dried cod is flaky rather than leathery, and it absorbs the flavor of whatever it is cooked with in a way that the beef never quite managed. There was a hierarchy of suffering aboard a pirate ship when it came to provisions, and most sailors understood it intuitively. Fresh food was luxury, temporary, precious, not to be wasted. Salt fish was tolerable. Salt pork was tolerable on a good day. Salt beef was the bottom of the barrel, sometimes literally, and it was what you ate when everything else was gone, or when the rationing had been strict enough that this was what your allocation for the day was. You ate it not because it was good, or because it was fine, or even because it was acceptable, but because the alternative to eating it was not eating. And not eating was worse. There is a record from a sailor aboard a merchant vessel in the 1720s, not a pirate ship, but conditions were similar enough to be informative, describing a piece of salt beef that had been in the barrel for what he estimated was around 4 months. He wrote that when they pulled it out, it was the color of old wood, that it was hard enough that a knife struggled to cut it, and that when they finally managed to break it apart and cook it, the smell drove several men to the other side of the deck. He ate it anyway. He described it as tasting like the ocean smells after something has died in it. Then he noted, with what reads as genuine resignation, that there would be more tomorrow. That is the emotional texture of salt meat at sea. Not drama, not rebellion. Just a kind of steady, experienced endurance. The understanding that this is what it is, that it has been this way before and will be this way again, and that the body will keep functioning on it for now, even if it is difficult to feel grateful about that fact. The cook's job in all of this was to make the intolerable merely unpleasant. The best ship's cooks, and there were good ones, men who had spent years learning what could be done with these raw materials, developed real skill at managing the salt meat. They knew how long to soak it for different conditions. They knew what to add to the cooking water to reduce the smell and improve the flavor. Onions when available, vinegar when that was available, pepper and other spices when those were carried. They knew how to combine the salt meat with hardtack and whatever else was on hand to produce something that resembled a meal in shape and function, even when it fell short in taste. That knowledge was worth something. It was worth quite a lot, actually, on a ship where morale and the meat supply were both already strained to their limits. The men knew it too. A good cook was protected, respected, and in some documented cases, given preferential treatment in the distribution of better provisions when better provisions were available. A bad one, or worse, no cook at all, was a problem that affected every person on the ship, every day, for the duration of the voyage. What nobody on that ship could fix, no matter how skilled they were, was what the diet of salt meat and hardtack was doing to them beneath the surface. You could soak the beef, you could add the onion, you could combine it with the biscuit and call it dinner, and eat it with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. What you could not do was put back what wasn't there. And what wasn't there, what had been stripped out by the salt, cooked away in the barrel. Absent from the flour, missing from every bite of every meal for weeks on end, was what the body needed to hold itself together. That absence was building towards something that would start quietly, with small things, a bruise that didn't heal properly, gums that felt tender in the morning, an unusual tiredness that wasn't entirely explained by the work. Small things that sailors noticed and mostly ignored, because small things were normal at sea and there was always too much else to pay attention to. But this particular small thing had a way of growing. It started with the gums. That was usually the first sign, and experienced sailors knew it for what it was the moment they felt it. A tenderness along the gum line, a slight swelling, a sensitivity to pressure that hadn't been there a week ago. They knew it, because they had seen it before, or heard about it from men who had, or read about it in the kind of informal sailor's knowledge that passed from ship to ship across generations without ever being written down in any official document. They knew what came next, and there was nothing they could do about it. Scurvy is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C. This is the sentence that appears in every textbook, in every Wikipedia article, in every documentary that touches on the subject. And it is true, and it tells you almost nothing useful about what scurvy actually felt like to live through. Vitamin C, ascorbic acid, is something the human body cannot produce on its own. It has to come from food. And unlike some other essential nutrients, the body stores only a very small amount of it. Deprive a person of vitamin C entirely, and the first symptoms appear within about 4 to 6 weeks. In another month or two, the situation becomes serious. After about 3 months without it, people die. The mechanism is specific and fairly grim. Vitamin C is required for the body to produce collagen, which is the structural protein that holds connective tissue together: skin, blood vessel walls, gums, tendons, the material that keeps healed wounds closed. All of it depends on a continuous supply of collagen. Stop making collagen, and the body begins, very slowly, to come apart at the seams. Old injuries reopen. Tissue that was healed becomes unhealed. The body starts to undo its own previous repairs. This is the part that sailors found most disturbing, and with good reason. A man who had taken a sword cut 5 years ago and healed completely, the wound closed, the skin scarred over, the scar faded, would find that scar beginning to open again as his scurvy progressed. Not because anything had happened to it, not because of any new injury. The wound simply reopened, as though the years of healing had been cancelled, as though the body had decided to return to a previous state. Sailors reported this with a horror that comes through clearly even in the dry language of ship's logs and court depositions. Something about the body undoing its own work, reversing time in a sense, pulling a man back through his injuries, struck them as deeply unnatural in a way that even the other horrors of the sea did not. But that came later. The early stages were more mundane, which made them easier to ignore. After the gums came the fatigue, a heaviness that went beyond tiredness, a weight in the limbs that made climbing the rigging, already dangerous, already exhausting, feel nearly impossible. Men who had been competent and energetic became slow, careful, reluctant to move quickly. The officers noticed, the other sailors noticed. What they mostly concluded was that the affected men were being lazy, or were ill with something unrelated, or were simply not as tough as the job required. The idea that the food was doing this to them was not obviously available, because nobody had yet made the connection between diet and the disease in any systematic way. There were theories, of course, There were always theories. The most common one was that scurvy was caused by dampness, the perpetual moisture of a ship at sea, the wet clothes, the humid sleeping quarters below deck. Another was that it was caused by corrupted air in the hold, the same miasmatic reasoning that explained most disease at this point in history. Some believed it was caused by salt meat specifically, that something about the preservation process created a poison that built up in the body over time. This last theory was actually closer to the truth than the miasma theory, though for the wrong reasons. It wasn't that salt meat created a poison. It was that salt meat, combined with hardtack and almost nothing else, simply failed to provide what the body needed to function. Nobody in the Golden Age of Piracy understood this. The concept of vitamins did not exist. The word vitamin was not coined until 1912 by a Polish biochemist named Casimir Funk, who was working on a different deficiency disease entirely. In the early 1700s, the idea that a disease could be caused by the absence of something rather than the presence of something harmful was not part of anyone's medical thinking. Disease was what happened when something bad got into you, not when something necessary failed to. The practical observation that citrus fruit helped with scurvy had been made repeatedly, going back at least to the 1500s. A Scottish surgeon named James Lind conducted what is often cited as one of the first controlled clinical trials in medical history in 1747, testing different treatments on scurvy patients aboard the HMS Salisbury. He divided 12 sailors with scurvy into 6 pairs and gave each pair a different treatment: cider, vitriol, vinegar, seawater, a mixture of spices and barley water, and 2 oranges and a lemon. The pair who received the citrus recovered within days. The others mostly didn't. Lind published his findings in 1753 in a treatise on scurvy that laid out the evidence clearly. The British Navy did not make citrus juice standard issue until 1795, 42 years after the evidence was published, which tells you something about how medical knowledge and institutional practice have always related to each other, and it is not a flattering something. For the pirates of the Golden Age, this meant that scurvy was simply a feature of the longer voyages. Not a surprise, not something that caught anyone off guard, just a thing that happened, that you watched happen, and that you tried to manage through whatever imperfect means were available. Those means included stopping at islands to gather whatever fruit was accessible, purchasing or stealing citrus when in port, eating fresh turtle and fish when they could be caught, because fresh meat contains at least some vitamin C, even if nobody knew why it helped, and rationing the voyage carefully so that extended periods at sea without land access were avoided where possible. Some captains were better at this than others. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates of the period, was known for running a tight, and somewhat disciplined ship. His articles of agreement included rules about when lights were extinguished and how disputes were to be settled. And he seems to have paid attention to provisioning in a way that some of his contemporaries didn't. Whether this extended to deliberately seeking out anti-scorbutic provisions is not clear from the historical record, but his crew's effectiveness over a sustained period of high activity suggests they were not being destroyed by deficiency disease at the rate some other ships were. Other captains were considerably worse at it, and the records of ships that lost significant portions of their crew to scurvy on long Atlantic crossings or extended Pacific voyages make for difficult reading. Not dramatic, the language in the logs is usually matter of fact, because the men writing those logs had seen it before and were not surprised. But difficult, a man going from fully functional to dead in the space of 8 to 10 weeks, the progression moving from tender gums to exhaustion to the reopening of old wounds to the bruising that appeared without any injury to explain it. The skin going waxy and strange, the joints swelling, the teeth loosening in the gums and sometimes falling out. The teeth part was what people tended to remember and repeat, probably because it was visible. You could see it happening, which made it harder to ignore than the internal damage. A sailor who had lost several teeth to scurvy was walking evidence of what a long voyage on poor provisions could do to a body. The new recruits saw it and understood, in a way that no lecture or medical tract could have communicated, what they were actually signing up for. And they signed up anyway. The mathematics of it, from the perspective of a man with few options in 1715, were not entirely irrational. A long voyage might end in scurvy. It might also end in a share of captured cargo worth more than a year of legitimate wages. The privateer captains who recruited men, or the pirate captains who inherited them from captured vessels or signed them in port, were not recruiting men who didn't know the risks. They were recruiting men who had decided the risks were acceptable given the alternatives. Scurvy was a known cost of doing business. It was terrible, and it killed people, and experienced sailors were afraid of it the way experienced miners might be afraid of a cave-in. Not paranoid, not constantly dwelling on it, but aware of it with a background awareness that never entirely went away. What made it particularly cruel was that it was so close to being preventable. The cure, as Lind would demonstrate, was sitting in any Caribbean port in the form of limes and oranges and the juice of lemons. It was on the islands they passed. It was sometimes in the cargo of the ships they raided, but without the conceptual framework to understand why it worked, without the idea of a vitamin, without the idea that a disease could be an absence rather than a presence. Even men who observed that citrus helped tended to treat it as a remedy rather than a prevention. Something you gave to men who already had scurvy rather than something you ate continuously to avoid getting it in the first place. The body kept the score. Week by week, at sea, eating what there was to eat, the score mounted. And eventually, somewhere out on the water, the bill came due. The water problem came first. It always came first. Because without water you die in days, and the Atlantic does not care about your timeline. Before any pirate captain thought about the food, before he counted the barrels of salt beef or estimated how many weeks the hardtack supply would last, he thought about the water. How much was aboard? How clean it was? How long it would last at the current rate of consumption? And how quickly it was going to become a problem. Fresh water at sea was stored in wooden barrels. Oak, usually sealed with pitch or wax, stacked in the hold alongside everything else. In principle, this was a reasonable system. In practice, a wooden barrel full of fresh water, sitting in a dark, warm, wet ship's hold does not stay fresh for long. The wood itself is porous. It breathes, absorbs, releases. Bacteria find their way in through the seams, through the bunghole, through whatever imperfect seal the barrel has. Within a few weeks, the water that went in clear and cold has begun to change. It develops a color, sometimes faintly green, sometimes brown. It develops a smell. It develops a film on the surface that moves when you disturb it. Sailors had a term for this water. They called it stinking water, which was accurate, and they drank it anyway, which was necessary. You could sometimes improve it by adding a piece of charcoal to the barrel, which absorbed some of the organic compounds causing the smell. You could filter it through cloth. You could boil it, if boiling was practical, which on a ship with a strictly managed fire it often wasn't. None of these methods made the water good. They made it less bad, which was the best outcome available. The window between fresh water loaded in port and water that is actively making people sick was roughly 2 to 3 weeks under typical conditions, which meant that any voyage longer than about 2 weeks was already operating with compromised water. A transatlantic crossing took 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the winds and the route. The math was not favorable. This is where rum comes in. And not in the romantic way, not the pirate at sunset with a bottle way that the imagery suggests, but in the deeply practical, almost medical way that actually explains why rum was on every ship that could afford to carry it. Alcohol kills bacteria. Not efficiently, not completely, but at the concentrations present in rum, which ran somewhere between 40 and 50% alcohol by volume in the period, sometimes higher, depending on how it had been distilled and stored. It was hostile enough to microbial life that mixing it with the compromised water suppressed the worst of what was growing there. The water still wasn't clean. The rum didn't sterilize it. But it was meaningfully safer than drinking the water alone. And sailors had figured this out empirically long before anyone understood the bacteriology behind it. The standard naval ration in the British fleet, formalized in the early 1700s, was half a pint of rum per man per day. The pirates, who were not operating under naval regulations, but had access to the same supplies and the same inherited wisdom, generally drank in similar quantities, though the distribution was less formal. The rum ration was not a luxury, it was a survival tool. The men who drank their rum had a lower rate of waterborne illness than men who drank only water. And over a long voyage, that difference in illness rates was the difference between a functional crew and a diminished one. Rum was also the currency of morale in a way that nothing else was. The food was bad, the work was brutal. The sleeping conditions below deck were cramped and smelled of everything you would expect a space containing several dozen unwashed men to smell of. The rum was one of the few things that made any of this bearable in the short term, and captains who tried to reduce or eliminate the rum ration invariably found themselves managing a much unhappier crew. In the 1800s, when the British Navy began watering down the rum ration and eventually eliminated it entirely, the response from the lower decks was considered a minor institutional crisis. The pirates of the Golden Age did not water down their rum. They drank it neat, or mixed into the water to improve both the water's safety and its palatability. There is a drink from this period called grog, which entered the naval lexicon in the 1740s, when British Admiral Edward Vernon, nicknamed Old Grog by his sailors after the grogram cloak he habitually wore, ordered that the daily rum ration be diluted with water rather than issued neat. The sailors hated this. The name stuck anyway. Pirates, who were not subject to Vernon's orders, or anyone else's particularly, generally preferred their rum undiluted when they had the choice. The records suggest they had the choice fairly often. Beyond rum, there were other alcoholic provisions that appeared in ship's holds depending on what was available and what had been captured. Beer was common on shorter voyages. It kept better than water for the first few weeks and was less potent than rum, which was a consideration when you needed the crew to remain functional. Wine appeared on ships operating in the Mediterranean and along the European Atlantic coast. Brandy was found in the holds of French merchant vessels that got raided and rapidly transferred to the pirate ship's own supply. Each had its own preservation properties and its own role in the economy of fluid management at sea. The mathematics of water consumption on a long voyage were calculated carefully. A man at physical labor in tropical heat needs at least 2 liters of water a day to avoid dehydration, more in very hot conditions, considerably more if he is ill or has been in the sun. A ship's company of, say, 80 men on a 6-week voyage in the Caribbean needed something in the range of 67,000 liters of water to stay minimally hydrated. And that was before accounting for cooking, for the water used to soak the salt meat, for the water lost to spillage and evaporation and the general chaos of shipboard life. Loading that quantity of water was a logistical challenge that shaped every provisioning stop, every port visit, every decision about how long a ship could stay at sea before it had to find land. When the water ran out, really ran out, not just got old, but was genuinely gone, the situation became dangerous very quickly. There are accounts from the period of ships that miscalculated their provisions and found themselves weeks from any known port with no fresh water aboard. What followed was not gentle. Men drank seawater when they could not stop themselves, which made dehydration worse because the salt load overwhelmed the kidneys. They chewed on anything moist, fishing lines that had been in the sea, pieces of wet canvas. They collected rain when it fell, holding out every container they had, catching it in the sails if the sails could be positioned for it. A good rainstorm at the right moment could save a ship. Several weeks without rain, already dehydrated, already rationed, already compromised by the weeks of poor food and accumulated physical stress, that was a different story. Pirate ships, more than legitimate naval vessels, had a degree of flexibility in their provisioning that came from their operating model. A naval frigate had assigned stations and routes and couldn't simply pull into any convenient harbor when the water got low. A pirate ship, in principle, could go where the water was. This was one of the genuine advantages of operating outside official structures. The ability to stop where it was practical rather than where orders dictated. Captains who were good at route planning used this flexibility deliberately, identifying islands with fresh water sources, coves with rivers running to the sea, places where a ship could anchor safely and send boats ashore to fill the barrels without too much risk of encountering people who would object to the process. The Caribbean, where much of the Golden Age piracy happened, is actually reasonably well supplied with fresh water if you know where to look. Many of the smaller islands have springs and streams. The larger islands have rivers. The pirate ports, Nassau, Tortuga, Port Royal, before the earthquake of 1692, took most of it into the sea, were specifically located in places where provisioning was practical, where fresh water was accessible, where a ship could be resupplied and put back to sea in a reasonable time without too much difficulty. The problem was the stretches between those ports, the open ocean crossings, the extended pursuits of target ships that took a pirate vessel away from known provisioning stops for longer than planned. The periods of bad luck when no prizes were taken and no port was practical, and the water in the barrels kept getting worse, and the rum level in the rum barrels kept getting lower, and the cook kept producing the same salt, beef from the same depleted barrels, and the crew kept eating it. Because what else were they going to do? Those were the stretches that tested everyone: captain, cook, crew. The ability to manage a ship's company through weeks of accumulated deprivation without losing control of the situation was one of the things that separated a successful pirate captain from an unsuccessful one. The ones who managed it did so through a combination of discipline and judgment, knowing when to enforce rationing strictly and when loosening it slightly would buy more in morale than it cost in supply, knowing when to push for the next port and when to stop at an unplanned location because the water situation had become too serious to ignore. The ones who didn't manage it sometimes found themselves facing a crew that had run out of patience. A ship at sea with no water and a hungry, exhausted crew, and a captain who seemed to have no plan, was a ship where mutiny became a rational calculation rather than an extreme one. Most of the famous mutinies of the Age of Sail, pirate and otherwise, have some version of provisions failure somewhere near the root of them. Water and rum, the two liquids that kept a ship alive. Neither of them good. Neither of them what anyone would have chosen. Both of them absolutely non-negotiable. On the days when the barrels were full and the rum was flowing at the regular ration and the water was only slightly bad rather than genuinely alarming, those were good days by the standards available. And when the fish were jumping alongside the ship and someone had the skill and the equipment to catch them, those days were better still. There were good days at sea. Not many and not predictable, but they existed, and the men who experienced them remembered them with a clarity that the bad days, which blurred together into a single long grey memory of salt and hardtack and bad water, rarely produced. A good day at sea, in nutritional terms, usually meant something had been caught. Something fresh, something that had been alive that morning and was now in the cook's pot, and the smell coming from the galley was the smell of actual food rather than the smell of salt meat being coerced back into edibility. Fresh food at sea was the exception. It was also, by a significant margin, the best thing about being at sea. The simplest and most reliable source of fresh protein was fish. The ocean is full of fish, which is obvious, but catching them from a moving vessel using the equipment available in the 1700s required a specific kind of patience and skill that not every sailor had, and not every ship's complement included. Line fishing off the stern was the most common method. A weighted line with a hook baited with whatever was available. Salt meat scraps usually, lowered into the water and tended by whoever had drawn that duty or volunteered for it. The success rate varied enormously, depending on where the ship was, what season it was, and how much luck was running. In the Caribbean, which was the operating territory for most of the Golden Age pirates, the fishing was generally good. The waters were warm and rich, with species that came readily to a baited hook, snapper, grouper, mackerel, various species of jack. A patient man with a good line could pull up enough fish in an afternoon to supplement the day's ration meaningfully, and on particularly good days to provide the entire evening meal without touching the salt provisions at all. Those days were celebrated. The crew knew what fresh fish meant. A night without the grey beef, without the hardtack soaking in salty broth and calling itself a meal. A night when the food actually tasted like food. Flying fish were a particular windfall, and they required almost no effort to catch. These are real fish, members of the family Exocoetidae, found throughout the tropical and subtropical Atlantic, that have developed elongated pectoral fins that allow them to leap from the water and glide for distances of up to 200 meters, sometimes longer, with a favorable wind. They do this to escape predators, which is a reasonable strategy in the water and a less effective one in the air over a ship's deck. At night, flying fish are attracted to light, and ships with lanterns burning created an accidental trap. The fish would leap toward the glow, overshoot, and land on the deck, where they could simply be picked up. Sailors on Caribbean crossings reported finding dozens of flying fish on deck in the mornings, and the cook who woke up to a deck scattered with fresh fish was having a better morning than most. The fish were small, typically 20 to 30 centimeters, nothing substantial, but they were fresh, and fresh was the thing that mattered. Pan-fried in whatever fat was available, or simply grilled over the cook fire, they provided protein and flavor, and the particular psychological lift that comes from eating something that tastes the way food is supposed to taste. On a ship where the baseline was salt beef, 3 weeks out of the barrel, a plate of fresh fish was not just dinner. It was a reminder that food could be a pleasure rather than a maintenance task. Dolphins were another matter. The common dolphin and the bottlenose dolphin both range throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic, and they have a well-documented habit of riding the bow wave of ships, which brought them into close proximity with the crew on a regular basis. Whether sailors ate dolphins is a question with a somewhat complicated answer. They could. A dolphin is a large animal, enough meat to feed a significant portion of a ship's crew from a single animal, and there are records of dolphins being taken at sea when other provisions were running critically low. The meat is dark and strongly flavored, closer to beef than to fish in texture, and opinions on it varied. It was not a first choice. It was a choice you made when the other options were worse. Sharks were similar, occasionally taken, not enthusiastically eaten, but present in the calculation when necessity required it. Shark meat in the 1700s had a reputation, mostly deserved, for being strong-flavored and somewhat unpleasant, though certain species are more palatable than others, and proper preparation, soaking, salting, cooking at length, improved it considerably. The sailors who ate shark tended to do so without much comment in the records, which probably means it was neither as terrible as feared nor as good as hoped. Sea turtles were different. They were actively sought. The green sea turtle in particular was considered genuinely good eating, and not just by the standards of men who had been living on hardtack for 3 weeks. European travelers and sailors had been enthusiastic about sea turtle since their first contact with Caribbean waters in the late 1400s. And by the Golden Age of Piracy, the large turtle populations of the Caribbean, the Cayman Islands in particular, were named for the enormous concentrations of sea turtles found there, were well known to sailors operating in the region. Turtle soup made from the callipee, the gelatinous yellowish fat attached to the lower shell, was considered a delicacy in London by the mid-1700s, the kind of thing served at formal dinners and described in enthusiastic terms by food writers of the period. At sea, the appeal was more basic, but no less genuine. A large green sea turtle could weigh 150 kilograms or more. That was an enormous quantity of fresh meat, enough to feed a crew of 80 men a proper meal, with some left over for the next day. The meat was rich and flavorful, somewhere between beef and chicken, with a quality entirely its own. The fat was used in cooking. The liver was eaten. The eggs, if the turtle was female and gravid, were a delicacy that even men who claimed not to care much about food found difficult to pass up. Nothing was wasted. There was never any reason to waste anything. Catching sea turtles required getting close to them, which meant either finding them sleeping on the surface. Turtles need to breathe air and rest at the surface regularly, or locating their nesting beaches and taking them there. The sleeping surface catch was an art. Approach slowly, upwind, making as little disturbance as possible, and flip the turtle onto its back before it could react. A turtle on its back cannot right itself and cannot escape. The beach method was easier, but required knowing where nesting beaches were and timing arrivals correctly. Female sea turtles come ashore in large numbers during nesting season, which made them briefly and spectacularly available to anyone who knew where to be and when. Pirate captains who knew the Caribbean well, who had spent years operating in those waters and had accumulated detailed knowledge of where fresh water could be found, where turtle nesting happened, where fish were reliably plentiful, had a genuine advantage in keeping their crews fed on long voyages. That knowledge was valuable and was passed among sailors through the same informal networks that carried everything else that mattered at sea. The best captains had it and used it deliberately. They planned routes that took them past known provisioning opportunities. They stopped when they could, rather than pushing through when it wasn't strictly necessary. They understood that a crew that had eaten fresh food in the last week was in meaningfully better condition, physically, mentally, emotionally, than a crew that hadn't. Birds occasionally supplemented the diet. Seabirds, frigate birds, boobies, various species of tern could sometimes be taken when they landed on the rigging or came close enough to the ship to be caught or struck down. They were small and not particularly good eating, but they were protein and they were fresh, which was two qualifications that overrode most objections. Boobies in particular, being famously unafraid of humans, Their name derives from the Spanish bobo, meaning fool or dunce, a reference to their habit of landing on ships and simply standing there, were sometimes taken in numbers when they congregated around a vessel. The cook's role in all of this was to maximize what had been caught, to combine it with the existing provisions in ways that stretched both, to use the fat from a turtle to improve the texture of the salt beef, to use fresh fish to make the hardtack broth taste like something. A good ship's cook was essentially a daily improviser, working with a constantly changing and generally inadequate set of ingredients, trying to produce something that would feed 80 hungry men and leave them in a state to do their jobs. The fresh catches were gifts, welcome, celebrated, immediately useful. A turtle taken on a Tuesday meant the crew ate well on Tuesday night and possibly Wednesday morning, and the cook had something to work with instead of the bottom of the salt barrel. These moments of fresh food at sea were not just about nutrition, though the nutrition mattered enormously. They were about something harder to quantify, the difference between surviving a voyage and inhabiting one, the difference between enduring the sea and occasionally, briefly, enjoying it. A man who had spent 2 weeks eating salt beef and hardtack and drinking rum-cut water, who sat down on a Wednesday evening to a bowl of fresh turtle stew, was not the same man he had been at breakfast. The food had done something to him beyond filling him up. It had reminded him that the world contained things worth eating, that the body was capable of pleasure as well as endurance, that the sea occasionally offered gifts alongside its hardships. He would need that memory, because the port, when they finally reached it, was going to confirm everything he had been missing in ways that nothing else could. The first thing they smelled was the land. Before they could see it clearly, before the coastline resolved itself out of the haze on the horizon into something with shape and detail, the smell arrived. Green things, soil, wood smoke from cooking fires ashore, the particular warm organic richness of a tropical island that has been baking in the sun all day and is now releasing everything it has absorbed into the evening air. To a man who had been at sea for 3 weeks, or 5, or 8, breathing nothing but salt air and the complex interior atmosphere of a wooden ship's lower deck, that smell was almost physical. It hit somewhere deep and animal, below thought, below language. It meant land. It meant fresh water. It meant food. The approach to port after a long voyage was one of the most emotionally loaded moments in the entire cycle of a pirate's life at sea. The mood on deck changed visibly as the island grew larger. Men who had been moving with the careful, deliberate economy of people conserving energy became animated. Conversations started that hadn't been happening before. There was laughter, actual laughter, not the grim, ironic variety that had been the main available kind for the past several weeks, but genuine laughter about things that weren't dark. The cook started talking about what he was going to eat first. The men started talking about what they were going to drink first. These were the two main categories of anticipation, and they were not equally weighted. After weeks of compromised water and rationed rum, the drinking was usually more urgent than the eating, at least for the first hour or two. What happened in port depended on which port it was. Nassau in the Bahamas, during its golden period as a pirate haven in the 1710s, was a specific kind of place, chaotic, crowded, lawless in the most operational sense of that word, full of men who had recently come off ships and were in the process of spending whatever they had earned or stolen as quickly and completely as possible. The provisioning merchants knew their clientele. The taverns knew their clientele. The women who sold food from stalls along the waterfront knew their clientele. Everyone in a pirate port understood that the men coming off these ships had been at sea for weeks, were desperately in need of things that could only be obtained on land, and had varying amounts of money and varying amounts of self-control, the latter quantity generally running lower than the former. Fresh fruit was the first priority for anyone who had been at sea long enough to feel the early signs of scurvy, whether or not they recognized what those signs were. The Caribbean provided this in extraordinary abundance: mangoes, pineapples, guavas, papayas, citrus in every form. In Nassau or Tortuga or any of the smaller island stops, fruit was cheap, available, and consumed in quantities that would seem excessive to someone who had not just spent a month without it. Men ate until they were uncomfortable, and then ate more. The body's response to vitamin C after deprivation is not subtle. Within days of adequate intake, the early symptoms of scurvy begin to reverse. The gum tenderness eases. The persistent fatigue lifts slightly. The general fog that had been settling over everything starts to clear. The men didn't know why this happened. They knew that it happened, and they sought it out with the directness of animals following instinct. Fresh meat came next, or alongside, or mixed into everything. An animal killed that morning and cooked the same day was something categorically different from anything available at sea, and the difference was not small. The texture was different, not the resistance of salt beef that had been soaked for a day and still fought back, but the yielding softness of fresh muscle that gave way cleanly to a knife or a tooth. The flavor was different in ways that are difficult to articulate to someone who hasn't experienced the contrast from the other side. After weeks of salt, everything fresh tasted almost shockingly itself. The animal flavor of fresh pork, the clean fat of a freshly killed chicken, the specific richness of a goat that had been roasting over a fire for several hours and was now falling off the bone. Chickens were everywhere in Caribbean port towns, as they are everywhere in the tropics where people have lived for any length of time, and they were purchased or simply taken with a frequency that the historical records mention casually enough to suggest it was completely routine. A live chicken was better than a dead one because it could be kept alive until needed and then killed fresh, which was how the provisioning worked. When a ship was preparing to leave, some livestock went aboard alive and was slaughtered during the first days of the voyage, when fresh meat was still possible before the salt provisions had to take over. Goats served the same purpose and were more resilient at sea than pigs, which are sensitive to the motion and the heat and the generally terrible conditions of a ship's hold, in ways that goats are somewhat less sensitive to. A pirate ship leaving port with 3 or 4 goats aboard had perhaps a week of fresh milk and eventually fresh meat ahead of it. A week that was considerably better than what came after. The goats ate whatever was available: hardtack, rope scraps, the kind of things goats eat, and they were cared for with a practical affection. Because an animal that dies before it is supposed to die is wasted food, and wasted food was not something anyone in this situation was casual about. The taverns and cookshops of port towns near pirate operating areas had adapted entirely to their primary clientele. The food served in a Nassau tavern in 1715 was not what you would find in a London chop house or a Parisian cafe. It was what men who had been at sea for weeks wanted, which was large quantities of hot food, strong drink, and as little waiting as possible. Stews made from whatever was locally available, salt fish mixed with root vegetables, rice cooked in broth from boiled down meat, fried plantains, bread baked fresh that morning and still warm, eggs fried in fat, whole fish grilled over charcoal. None of it was refined. All of it was wanted with an intensity that made the question of refinement irrelevant. The eating that happened in the first hours and days after a long voyage was not dignified. This is worth being direct about. Men who had been carefully managing scarce provisions for weeks, who had been eating meals designed to sustain function rather than provide pleasure, who had been calculating every barrel and estimating every day's supply, those men, when released into an environment of relative abundance, ate with an abandon that observers found remarkable, and that the men themselves seemed to regard as entirely appropriate. The historical record contains accounts of sailors spending the entirety of their money on food and drink within the first few days of reaching port, which sounds irresponsible, and was irresponsible, and was also completely understandable to anyone who had been living the alternative. The body after long deprivation does not respond to refeeding with moderation. It responds with urgency. Everything tastes better than it actually is. Hunger that has been present for so long, it stopped feeling like hunger and just felt like a general state of existence suddenly becomes visible again as an absence. And the filling of that absence produces a pleasure disproportionate to the quality of the food involved. A sailor eating a plate of fried fish and plantains in a Nassau cookshop after 6 weeks at sea was not eating fried fish and plantains. He was eating the end of something, the release from something, the proof that the voyage was over and he had survived it. The food was almost secondary. What he was really consuming was the relief. Fresh water played its own role in this. The simple act of drinking clean, cold, fresh water, water from a spring or a river, water that had not been sitting in a barrel for a month, water that had no smell and no color, and tasted like nothing but itself, was something that men coming off long voyages described in their letters and journals with a feeling that seems excessive until you understand the context. A cup of fresh water after weeks of barrel water and rum was a specific kind of luxury, one that cost nothing in port and yet was valued with an almost irrational intensity by anyone who had been long enough without it. The port stop was also when fresh provisions were loaded for the next voyage. This was a financial decision as much as a logistical one, and it was one of the places where pirate economics differed from legitimate naval economics in ways that mattered. A naval provisioning process involved contracts, official suppliers, regulations about what had to be carried and in what quantities. A pirate captain buying provisions in a sympathetic port was negotiating directly, paying in cash or in goods taken from prizes, getting whatever was available at whatever the price was. This created opportunities. A captain with good relationships in port could sometimes get better provisions than the Navy's contracted suppliers provided, and vulnerabilities. Because a captain with no money and no prizes and no credit had to take whatever he could get at whatever price the seller chose to charge. The time in port was never long enough. It was never long enough because the money ran out, or because naval patrols made the harbor uncomfortable, or because the captain had information about a prize and wanted to move before the opportunity closed, or simply because enough time had passed that the question of what came next became more urgent than the pleasure of the present. The men who had been eating with abandon for 3 days started thinking about the next voyage. The cook started calculating what they needed to load. The captain started thinking about where they were going and how long they would be at sea and what the water situation looked like for the route he had in mind. And then they went back to the ship, back to the hold, back to the barrels that were full again for now, but wouldn't be full for long, back to the hardtack and the salt beef and the compromised water and the rum that made the water drinkable, back to the flying fish on the deck in the morning and the line off the stern in the afternoon, and the cook doing what he could with what he had. The memory of the port stayed with them, the taste of fresh fruit, the smell of meat properly cooked, the feel of clean water on a dry throat. Those memories were not decoration. They were fuel, the thing that made the next weeks of deprivation bearable. because they were evidence that the deprivation would eventually end, that there was a port somewhere ahead of them, another island, another cookshop, another barrel of clean water, and another morning of eating something that didn't require an act of will. And somewhere out on the water, there was also the possibility of something better still. Not a port, not purchased provisions, not fruit bought from a market stall. Something taken, something that had been on another ship a week ago and was now in the hold of this one, and which was better than anything that could be bought, because it had cost nothing except the risk of taking it. The moment a prize was taken, the moment the other ship struck its colors, or was boarded and subdued, or simply stopped running because there was nowhere left to run, the first thing that happened was not an inventory of the cargo hold. The first thing that happened was that men went looking for food. This was not officially sanctioned behavior. The articles of agreement that governed most pirate ships were specific about how captured cargo was to be divided: the captain's share, the quartermaster's share, the crew's shares distributed according to rank and role, and the terms everyone had agreed to before the voyage began. The process was supposed to be orderly. The reality, at the moment of capture, was somewhat less orderly than the process envisioned, particularly when the capturing crew had been at sea for 3 weeks and the captured ship turned out to be carrying provisions. What they were looking for, in rough order of priority, depended on what they had and what they needed. Fresh water, if the barrels were running low, was taken immediately and without ceremony. Barrels rolled across the deck, lowered into boats, transferred to the pirate ship before anything else moved. Rum and wine and other spirits followed. Then food, and the nature of the food search shifted depending on what the captured vessel was carrying and where it had come from. A merchant ship out of a European port bound for the Caribbean was a particular kind of prize from a provisioning standpoint. These ships carried the preserved foods of Europe: salt beef, salt pork, dried fish, hardtack not unlike what the pirate ship already had, cheese in wax-sealed rounds, butter packed in brine, smoked meats wrapped in cloth and stored in the dry part of the hold. None of this was fresh, but quality varied enormously between what a well-funded merchant house provisioned their ships with and what was loaded onto a pirate vessel in whatever port was convenient. Good English salt beef, properly packed in clean salt in new oak barrels, was meaningfully different from the grey, uncertain contents of a barrel that had been sitting in a Nassau warehouse since an unknown date. The pirates knew this. They made the distinction and took the better provisions with genuine enthusiasm. The things they really wanted, though, were the luxury provisions. Sugar was one of them. This requires some explanation, because from a modern perspective, sugar seems like an odd thing to prioritize in a raid. It is not protein. It is not vitamin C. It does not address scurvy or provide the kind of sustained nutrition that men doing physical labor in tropical heat actually need. But sugar in the early 1700s was not the ubiquitous cheap commodity it later became. It was expensive. It was produced in the Caribbean on slave plantations at enormous human cost and shipped to Europe, where it was bought by people who could afford it and used with the careful economy of something valuable. A hogshead of refined sugar, roughly half a metric ton, was worth real money in any port that traded with Europe, which was most ports. Taking sugar from a prize meant taking something that could be sold, something that translated directly into the money needed to buy the things that actually addressed the provisioning problem. But pirates also ate it, directly, immediately, in quantities that would have been unthinkable to anyone who had been paying market price for it. Men who had been eating hardtack and salt beef for weeks cracked open a barrel of sugar and ate handfuls of it, and the sensation, the clean sweetness of refined sugar after weeks of salt and nothing, was apparently something that bypassed rational calculation entirely and went straight to whatever part of the brain handles pleasure. There are accounts of men being physically ill from eating too much sugar too quickly after long deprivation, which is a condition that sounds almost comic until you remember the context. Molasses was taken as readily as refined sugar, and for similar reasons. It was a byproduct of the sugar refining process, thick and dark and intensely sweet, and it was used in the production of rum, which meant that a ship carrying molasses was carrying the raw material for the most important beverage in the pirate economy. A pirate crew that captured a molasses shipment and had access to a still could produce their own rum, which cut out the merchant entirely and was the kind of self-sufficiency that appealed to men operating outside normal economic structures. Spices were another category of captured provision that received attention disproportionate to their caloric contribution. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves. These were still luxury goods in the 1700s, worth significant money and making the difference between food that tasted like salt and food that tasted like something more than salt. The cook who got his hands on a good supply of pepper after months of having none was a man whose next few weeks were going to be meaningfully better than the previous ones, and whose crew was going to eat somewhat better too. Spices didn't solve the nutritional problems. They made the nutritional problems more bearable, which on a long voyage was almost as valuable. Chocolate deserves its own mention. Cacao was produced throughout the Caribbean and Central America, and processed chocolate, cacao paste, cacao powder, sometimes the finished chocolate mixed with sugar and spices, appeared in the cargo holds of ships trading in the region with some regularity. Chocolate in this period was primarily a drink rather than a solid food. Mixed with hot water or milk and often spiced, it was consumed by wealthy Europeans as a fashionable stimulant and by the Spanish colonial population in the Americas as an everyday provision. For a pirate crew that intercepted a cargo of processed cacao, the discovery was genuinely exciting. Chocolate provided fat, some protein, and genuine flavor after weeks of salt. A cup of hot chocolate made from captured cacao paste was an experience that sailors wrote about with a warmth that the food writing of the period rarely produced. Wine taken from prizes presented its own category of opportunity. Spanish and Portuguese merchant vessels crossing the Atlantic routinely carried wine for the crew, for the passengers, if there were passengers, as cargo destined for the colonial markets. The wines of the Iberian Peninsula traveled well. The fortified varieties in particular, Madeira wine, named for the Portuguese island of Madeira and produced specifically for the export trade, was formulated to survive long sea voyages in tropical heat, and when a pirate crew found a hold full of it, they had captured something that was both immediately drinkable and valuable as a trade good. Spanish ships often carried sherry, another fortified wine that traveled well. French ships carried Bordeaux and Burgundy that did not travel as well, but were consumed enthusiastically regardless of their condition. The process of going through a captured ship's provisions was not always clean or organized. Men who had been at sea for weeks and were running on adrenaline from the capture itself did not always observe careful protocols about what was taken and what was left. Barrels were opened and sampled before the quartermaster had a chance to inventory them. Bottles were opened. Things were eaten standing in the hold of another ship, with the chaos of the boarding still settling. The official distribution would happen later, but in the first hours after a successful capture, the line between individual initiative and collective theft was somewhat blurry, and the captains who tried to enforce strict order in that specific window were fighting a losing battle against human nature and weeks of accumulated hunger. What separated successful pirate captains from unsuccessful ones, in provisioning terms, was partly the ability to target the right prizes. A captain who had good information about what was moving through the shipping lanes, what merchant routes were active, what cargoes were being transported and when, which ships were likely to be carrying the kinds of provisions that his crew most needed, was in a better position than one who simply took what came. The intelligence networks that sustained Golden Age piracy were not just about knowing where the Navy was or which ports were safe. They included information about cargo, about provisioning ships, about the schedules of vessels that carried things the pirates needed as much as or more than they needed gold. Gold, in fact, was sometimes less useful than it appeared. Gold did not address scurvy. Gold could not be eaten when the hardtack ran out. Gold needed to be converted into goods through a market transaction, which required access to a market, which required reaching a port, which was not always immediately possible. A barrel of salt beef taken from a prize was worth something right now, today, on this ship, without any intermediary steps. The financial value of captured provisions was often lower than the financial value of captured coin or trade goods, but the immediate practical value was frequently higher, and experienced pirates understood this distinction and made their decisions accordingly. There is something almost paradoxical about the fact that the best food in a pirate's diet came from other people's ships. The system created a kind of enforced redistribution. Well-provisioned merchant vessels, loaded with the best available provisions by merchants who could afford quality, found those provisions transferred to pirate ships crewed by men who had been eating the worst available provisions for weeks. The merchant captain, watching his carefully chosen cargo disappear into the hold of a pirate vessel, was not comforted by the thought that it was going to someone who needed it more. But the pirate crew eating that cargo that evening was eating something better than they had eaten in weeks, and they knew it, and they were grateful for it with the specific gratitude of people who have been hungry long enough to understand what they were grateful for. The best captures combined all of it: the fresh water, the rum, the quality salt provisions, the sugar and the spices and the wine, the fresh livestock, if any was aboard. A ship well stocked enough to be worth capturing was sometimes enough to transform a voyage, to turn a crew that had been grinding through deprivation into one that was fed, rested, and ready for whatever came next. Those were the captures that the men talked about afterward, in taverns and in letters, and in the testimony they gave at trials, often with a specificity about the food that suggests it made as deep an impression as any of the violence surrounding it. The food from captured ships kept them going. The food from the next port kept them human. And the man who made all of it edible, who stood between the raw materials of the sea and the men who needed to eat them, was someone who has received far less attention in the historical record than he deserves. Every ship had one, or was supposed to have one. The reality of who actually ended up cooking on a pirate vessel was sometimes more complicated than the official designation suggested, but the role itself was non-negotiable. Someone had to stand at the fire, manage the provisions, and produce something resembling meals for the men, twice a day, every day, for the duration of the voyage. That someone was the ship's cook, and the degree to which he was good at his job had a measurable effect on everything from crew morale to the captain's ability to maintain order. The cook's position in the hierarchy of a ship was anomalous. He was not an officer. He did not navigate, did not command men in battle, did not make strategic decisions about where the ship went or what prizes were pursued. In terms of formal rank, he sat somewhere in the middle of the crew, above the common sailors in importance, below the quartermaster and the captain in authority. But in terms of daily impact on the lives of everyone aboard, he was arguably the most consistently influential person on the ship. The captain decided where to go. The cook decided what everyone ate when they got there, and what they ate in between, and how the provisions were managed, and whether the salt beef came out edible or came out as something that produced more problems than it solved. On legitimate naval vessels of the period, the ship's cook was often a man who had been assigned the role because he was unfit for more physically demanding duties. The Royal Navy in the 1700s had a formal policy of preferring disabled veterans for the cook's position. Men who had lost limbs in battle or been otherwise incapacitated for active service but could still stand at a fire and manage a pot. The logic was practical rather than humanitarian. The cook's job did not require climbing rigging or hauling lines or any of the other tasks that demanded a complete body. And giving the position to a man who couldn't do those things anyway was an efficient use of available manpower. It also meant, frankly, that naval cooking was not always in the hands of the most talented practitioners of the art. Pirate ships operated differently. The democratic structures that characterized most Golden Age pirate crews, the Articles of Agreement, the votes on major decisions, the checks on the captain's power, extended to crew selection in ways that naval vessels didn't experience. A cook who was genuinely bad at cooking, who produced meals that made the crew actively unhappy rather than just neutrally sustaining, was a cook whose position was more precarious than his naval counterpart. The men had more ability to make their displeasure felt, and they used it. There are records of ship's cooks being reassigned, replaced, demoted, outcomes that were unusual in the more rigid hierarchy of legitimate seafaring, but entirely possible in the more fluid power structures of a pirate ship. The kitchen itself, the galley, was a specific and carefully managed space. On most ships of the period, it was located in the forecastle, the forward section of the ship, which put it as far as possible from the powder magazine at the stern. This was not accidental. An open fire on a wooden ship packed with gunpowder was an existential risk, and every design decision about where to put the galley was made with that risk in mind. The cook fire was contained in a metal firebox, sometimes called the camboose or caboose, a term that would later migrate ashore and eventually become the American word for the last car on a freight train. Set on a bed of sand or brick to protect the wooden deck beneath it, the fire was strictly controlled. It was lit at specific times for cooking and extinguished when cooking was done. In bad weather, when the risk of fire spread was higher, and when the motion of the ship made working around an open flame actively dangerous, the fire was not lit at all, and the crew ate cold provisions. Cold provisions meant hardtack eaten dry, or salt meat eaten as it came out of the brine, an option that most sailors avoided unless the alternative was genuinely nothing, because salt meat without cooking was an experience that tested commitment. But it happened. In extended storms, in periods of severe weather that lasted days, the cook fire stayed cold, and the crew managed as best they could. When the fire was lit, the cook worked with a set of tools that would be recognizable to anyone who has ever cooked over an open flame, scaled up to the quantities required to feed dozens of men. Large iron pots for boiling, the primary cooking method for almost everything, because boiling required minimal supervision once underway and could be managed around the other demands on the cook's attention. A griddle or flat iron surface for the occasional fried preparation. Knives, cleavers, ladles, the basic equipment of any working kitchen. The cook had a small dedicated space that was his own, in a way that few spaces on a crowded ship were anyone's own, and he guarded it with a proprietorial intensity that the crew generally respected, partly because offending the cook had obvious practical consequences. The daily schedule of a ship's cook began before most of the crew was awake. The fire had to be started, which took time and care in a damp maritime environment. The provisions for the day had to be assessed, how much salt meat was being issued, whether it needed additional soaking, what could be added to the pot to make the result more than just boiled protein and salt water. The hardtack situation had to be evaluated. If anything had been caught the previous day, fish, a turtle, anything, it had to be dealt with before it went bad, which in tropical heat meant quickly. The cook was the first person fully engaged with the day's food, and often the last to finish with it, spending the early morning preparing and the midday cooking, and the afternoon managing whatever remained. The two main meals were served at roughly midday and in the early evening. Breakfast, if it existed as a separate meal, was usually minimal, hardtack, possibly some left over from the previous evening, if there was any, the rum ration that was sometimes issued in the morning rather than with meals. The main meals were when the cook's skill, or lack of it, became visible. The standard preparation for salt meat was a boil called lobscouse, which appeared on ships across the Atlantic world in various forms and under various names. A combination of salt beef, hardtack broken into pieces, and whatever vegetables or flavorings were available, boiled together in water until everything had softened into something that held together in a bowl. At its best, lobscouse was genuinely warming and filling, the kind of food that did what it was supposed to do, and did it without complaint. At its worst, it was grey water with things floating in it. The difference between those two outcomes was the cook. A skilled cook understood the salt meat in a way that took years to develop, knew which cuts responded better to longer soaking, knew how much of the brine flavor could be drawn out and how much would remain regardless of effort, knew that adding a small amount of vinegar to the cooking water changed the texture of the meat in ways that improved it, knew that the hardtack broke down better if it went in late rather than early. He knew what to do with fish when fish was available, how to combine fresh catch with the salt provisions to stretch both, how to use the fat from a piece of salt pork to fry the flying fish from the morning deck, in a way that produced something genuinely good rather than merely cooked. He knew that a handful of dried pepper changed the flavor of a pot of boiled salt beef in a way that lifted the mood of the men eating it, and that the men's mood affected their work, and that their work affected everything. This knowledge was accumulated over years at sea, passed from cook to cook through direct experience rather than written instruction. Cookbooks existed in the 1700s. The period saw a flourishing of culinary literature in England and France, but they were written for domestic kitchens with reliable supplies of fresh ingredients, not for iron fireboxes on wooden ships in the middle of the Atlantic. The ship's cook worked from memory and from the kind of practical intelligence that develops when the same problems present themselves every day and failure has immediate visible consequences. Some ship's cooks were excellent. There are accounts in the journals and letters of the period of particular cooks being mentioned by name, remembered by the men who sailed with them, sought out for subsequent voyages. A cook with a reputation traveled. Word spread in the ports and taverns where sailors congregated, and a man known to be good at his job could have his pick of ships to some degree, which gave him a negotiating position that most crew members lacked. Captain Bartholomew Roberts, whose ship and crew maintained a level of effectiveness that suggests reasonably good provisioning management, is known from court records to have had specific crew members in designated roles, including a cook. A man named Harry Glasby appears in the records, though his role was primarily navigator, and the cook's identity is less clear. What is clear is that Roberts ran his ship with enough attention to practical detail that the provisioning side of things was managed rather than simply endured. Other cooks were terrible. There were ships where the cook was the job nobody else wanted, filled by whoever was least useful for other purposes and least able to resist being assigned it. A bad cook on a long voyage was a slow-motion disaster, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that appears in the records as a single event, but a grinding daily erosion of morale and physical condition that made everything else harder. Men who are badly fed are slower, angrier, more prone to illness, less capable of the physical demands of sailing and fighting. A crew in poor nutritional condition was a less effective crew. The captains who understood this allocated resources accordingly, the ones who didn't sometimes found themselves managing consequences they didn't connect back to the food. The cook was also, in a practical sense, one of the people most likely to survive a captured ship's transition to pirate crew. When a merchant vessel was taken and the pirates went through the crew looking for men with useful skills, navigators, surgeons, carpenters, sailmakers. Cooks were on the list. A competent cook was a resource. He was offered the choice that captured sailors were typically offered: join the pirate crew, with the articles and the share of future prizes that entailed, or be set ashore at the nearest opportunity and return to legitimate life. Many took the offer. The work was not different, the conditions were not better, and the legal risks were considerably higher. But the pay, if the prizes were good, was in a different category entirely. What the cook represented, in the end, was the human need to eat and the human resistance to eating badly when something can be done about it. The provisions at sea were terrible. That was a given, a structural feature of the situation that no individual could change. But within that constraint there was still a range of outcomes, still a difference between managing the situation well and managing it poorly, still a space where skill and knowledge and attention produced results that mattered to the men eating them. The cook occupied that space every day, twice a day, in a smoky iron firebox on a wooden ship somewhere in the Atlantic. He did what he could with what he had, and what he could do, done well, made more difference than anyone who had not been hungry enough would ever quite understand. We started with a provocation that the men who sailed under the black flag during the Golden Age of Piracy were not killed by swords or cannonballs or naval pursuits, but by something quieter and more persistent, by the food they ate, by the water they drank, by the slow accumulation of absences that the body eventually could not absorb any further. Having spent the last several hours with the specific details of that claim, it is worth returning to it and asking whether it holds up. It does, and it doesn't, which is the honest answer. The food was genuinely terrible. Not in the way that people say food is terrible when they mean it was uninspiring, or when they mean it failed to meet their expectations. Terrible in a technical sense, deficient in most of the things the human body requires beyond raw calories, contaminated in ways that caused real illness, preserved in conditions that produced results ranging from unpleasant to dangerous. Hardtack riddled with weevil larvae, salt beef that had been in a barrel for 12 weeks and had developed opinions about what it was becoming. Water from a barrel that had been sitting in a tropical ship's hold since the last port stop. This was not food that a person would choose given alternatives. It was food that people ate because the alternatives were worse, and yet the men who ate it crossed oceans. They managed ships. They fought when fighting was required, with enough effectiveness to take prizes from vessels that were often larger and better armed. They navigated, calculated, made decisions under pressure, maintained the complex social structures of life at sea under conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by any modern standard. The food that was killing them slowly was also, in a minimal and reluctant way, keeping them alive. That contradiction was the basic condition of seafaring in the 1700s, pirate or otherwise, and the men who lived it did not regard it as a contradiction so much as a fact of the world they inhabited. What piracy added to this equation was a particular relationship with the food. Legitimate sailors endured the provisions because enduring the provisions was the job. Pirates endured the provisions, because enduring the provisions was the price of the opportunity for the prize, for the share, for the moment when the captured ship yielded something worth taking, and the calculation that had seemed questionable for the past 6 weeks suddenly looked reasonable again. The food was the cost. The prizes were the payment. Most of the men who signed pirate articles understood this clearly and had decided, in the cold practical arithmetic of their available options, that the terms were acceptable. The captured provisions were the most eloquent expression of this dynamic. The best thing a pirate ate came from someone else's ship. The sugar eaten in handfuls in a prize ship's hold. The wine from a captured Portuguese merchant. The chocolate from a Spanish colonial vessel heading to Seville. The fresh salt beef from a well-provisioned English merchant, packed in clean salt in new barrels by a contractor who was not trying to defraud the Royal Navy. These foods were better not just because they were objectively better quality, though most of them were. They were better because they had been taken, because the risk and the effort and the weeks of bad food had produced this specific outcome. This barrel of sugar in this hold on this particular afternoon. The sweetness was inseparable from the context that made it sweet. There is something in this that goes beyond nutrition, beyond the history of seafaring, beyond even the specific story of Golden Age piracy. The human relationship with food is never just about calories. It is always also about meaning, about what the food represents, about what it cost, about who shared it, and under what circumstances, and after how long a period of going without. The pirates who ate well in port after weeks of salt beef were not just restoring their vitamin C levels and topping up their protein. They were doing something that humans have always done after periods of scarcity, eating with a gratitude and an intensity and a pleasure that ordinary meals in ordinary circumstances rarely produce. The deprivation made the abundance real in a way that abundance alone never quite manages. This is perhaps the strangest thing about the food history of the Golden Age of Piracy. Not the weevils, though the weevils are genuinely remarkable. Not the scurvy, though the scurvy is genuinely terrible. Not the logistics of keeping a ship's company fed for months in the open Atlantic, though that is a genuine achievement of practical intelligence even when it went wrong. The strangest thing is that the people doing it were not broken by it. They adapted to it, complained about it constantly and creatively, developed specific skills for managing it, celebrated the exceptions with a vividness that the historical record still communicates across 3 centuries, and then went back out and did it again. The sea offered them a life that was harder and shorter and more uncertain than anything available on land, and they chose it. The food was part of what made it hard. The food was also, on the days when something fresh had been caught, and the cook was good, and the rum was flowing at the regular ration, and the prize taken last week meant the barrels were full again. On those days, the food was part of what made it bearable, part of what made the whole brutal enterprise feel, briefly, like something worth having chosen. That is what people have always done with food in hard circumstances. Made of it whatever meaning was available. Used it as a measure of how things were going and a promise of how they might go. Ate the bad provisions with their eyes open and the good ones with something approaching joy. The pirates of the Golden Age were not exceptional in this. They were, in this particular respect, completely ordinary. People doing what people do. Finding in the daily necessity of eating a small and reliable way of taking stock of where they were and what they had and what might still be coming. The hardtack is gone. The salt beef barrels are empty. The rum has been drunk and the captured sugar has been eaten, and the fresh turtle from last week is a memory. Somewhere ahead of them is the next port, and the next prize, and the next good meal, eaten in the specific way that good meals taste, after you have gone without for long enough. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. Let the sounds of the world grow quiet around you. Somewhere out on the dark water, a ship is moving. The cook has banked the fire for the night. The men are sleeping in their hammocks below deck, the ship rising and falling in long, slow swells, the stars enormous overhead. Tomorrow there will be hardtack again. Tonight, someone caught 3 fish off the stern in the last hour of light, and they were good, and for a little while it was enough. Good night. Sleep well.